Well, it depends on what you mean by satisfied. Some debts have to be paid in full over the life of the Chapter 13 plan. Simple, obvious example is certain tax debts. They're what's known as priority tax debts and also secured tax debts. So let's take a look at these one at a time. The secured tax debt is a debt that is secured by some tangible asset of yours. So perhaps you owe to the IRS, and the IRS has recorded a lien against your property. So that's a secured tax that you have to pay in full over the life of the plan. The priority tax, you also have to pay in full over the life of the plan. What's a priority tax debt? Well, Congress, in its extremely finite wisdom, has seen fit to break up unsecured debts, that is, debts where there isn't collateral that can be repossessed in the event of a default, into two separate categories: priority unsecured debts and non-priority unsecured debts. Those are sometimes referred to as general unsecured debts. So if a tax debt is a priority tax debt, it must be paid in full within 60 months. So the plan can't last more than 60 months, so you have to pay that priority tax debt in full. If your plan doesn't provide for paying that tax debt in full, the judge isn't going to confirm the plan. So you will not end up owing on that tax debt at the completion of the plan, because one of the requirements of the plan is the tax debt has to be paid in full. There are other kinds of priority debts. For example, if you owe back child support or alimony, that must be paid in full by the end of the plan. And while you're in the plan, you have to remain current on all those domestic support obligations that come due after the day you file your petition. If you have general unsecured debts, most of those are dischargeable. And if you have a dischargeable unsecured debt and you pay it less than 100%, then at the completion of the Chapter 13 plan, the unpaid portion is simply discharged when you get your Chapter 13 discharge. So you don't owe any more on that debt. There is a very important exception to that rule, and that is student loans. Student loans are general unsecured debt. Congress in the Bankruptcy Code has not given them priority status. However, they are non-dischargeable. So what that means is if you don't have a 100% plan and you get to the end of your plan and you haven't paid the student debt in full over the life of the plan, the unpaid portion is still due. You'll certainly get credit for the portion that you paid through the plan, but you will still owe the unpaid portion when you get your discharge. Another kind of a debt that can be a problem is a debt that has been determined to be non-dischargeable through what's called an adversary proceeding. So there are three types of general unsecured debts that come up in this context. They're debts incurred through fraud, debts that are the result of a breach of a fiduciary duty, and debts that are the result of doing willful and malicious harm to a person. Now, those of you that have a passing knowledge of the Bankruptcy Code may say, well, wait a minute, what about willful and malicious harm to property? In a Chapter 13, that is dischargeable. So that wouldn't have to be paid in full, but the willful and malicious harm to a person does have to be paid in full. Well, what happens here? You file the petition, creditor gets the notice, determines that this debt should be non-dischargeable, and initiates a special kind of a lawsuit in the bankruptcy court. It's called an adversary proceeding. And the big picture goal of that creditor is to get the judge to say, this is a non-dischargeable debt. If the creditor wins, then that debt is non-dischargeable. But remember, it's general unsecured, and so it gets paid at the same percentage as the other general unsecured debt, which means that as with the student loan, at the completion of the plan, if you didn't pay that debt in full, you still owe the unpaid portion. You still get credit for the amount you paid through the plan, but the unpaid portion you're still going to owe. So that's why it's important to do some careful pre-bankruptcy planning, because at least in the realm of fraud debts, one type of fraud debt that comes up is a debt that's very recent, And so pre-bankruptcy planning can help to at least reduce the likelihood of one of those adversary proceedings. The long and short is, in theory, when you complete your Chapter 13 plan and you didn't pay the creditors in full, the unpaid portion is discharged, but there are those caveats here. Debts that are student loans that aren't paid in full, you still owe the remaining balance at the completion of the plan, and debts that have been determined through litigation to be non-dischargeable, the unpaid portion you still owe at the completion of the plan.